Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 587. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot of news to get through on today's show. Things have been extremely busy, lots of things going on around the world. So I'm going to jump right into it today. Just be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's out anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_, where I post all the shows that I put out, as well as all of the articles I write and any other news I think that is really important. All right, getting into it today. First up, an article I wrote for the Institute on May 1st. U.S. constructed base in Haiti won't be ready for Kenyan troops on time. The Biden administration's plan to restore order to Haiti by sending an armed international force has hit another snag. The base that will house the soldiers will not be ready by the date they are set to arrive in the Caribbean nation. Jay Johnston from the Center for Economic and Policy Research told Politico that the Kenyan-led forces will arrive in Haiti on May 23rd. However, the U.S. constructed base they will be stationed at will not be completed by that time. Washington and Nairobi are eyeing that date to begin operations in Port-au-Prince, as Kenyan President William Ruto is scheduled to be in the U.S. on that day, officials confirmed to Politico. And so this isn't really a surprise. The U.S. government, particularly under the Biden administration, really likes to do these things where they incorporate anything they're doing with a photo op. And so, having William Ruto come to the U.S., Biden will shake hands, take a picture, and then they'll declare, oh, what a good thing that we're doing here in Kenya. When, of course, the reality is going to be far darker. So Johnston said that the second issue was the deployment will be far smaller than initially discussed. While the U.S. plan called for 1,000 Kenyan armed men to be joined by thousands of soldiers from several other countries, including Benin and some other Caribbean nations, Johnston told Politico that only 200 Kenyans are scheduled to deploy to Haiti. I did not see anything on the potential reasons why the deployment would be so much smaller than initially planned. My guess is that it may be a training issue or a troop issue for Kenya, that they just don't have 1,000 troops to send for whatever reason. It's also possible that the Kenyans are more going to lead this force, and it's really going to be the soldiers from Benin and other countries that are involved in the actual operation. So my guess is those details will clear up over the next 3 weeks as we get closer to this deployment. It's also unclear if the force will be able to carry out its mission to restore order and hand control of Haiti to the new U.S.-backed transitional government. In 2021, Haitian President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated, creating a power vacuum. Washington facilitated Ariel Henry to rise to power. After taking control of Haiti, Henry proved to be an ineffective leader. He lost an increasing amount of power in Port-au-Prince to paramilitary organizations, leading him to appeal to the U.S. and UN for support. For over a year, Washington has lobbied the UN Security Council to approve an armed force to be sent to Port-au-Prince to hand power back to Haiti. The U.S. struggled to find a partner to lead the mission before it was able to incentivize Kenya with financial and military assistance last year. The deployment met significant opposition in Nairobi, leading to a court battle that delayed the deployment by several months. The proposed Kenyan mission to Haiti has faced opposition by many locals. Once Henry began backing the plan, he was met with dissent from Haitian citizens. UN peacekeepers deployed to Haiti between 2004 and 2017 were notorious for committing sexual violence against women. Additionally, 10,000 Haitians died from a cholera outbreak caused by the UN force. Earlier this year, when Henry was traveling to Nairobi to ink the agreement for Kenyan troops to deploy to Haiti, paramilitary organizations seized swaths of Port-au-Prince and prevented Henry from returning to Haiti. Once Henry was unable to even set foot in Haiti, he lost favor with Washington, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken pushed him to resign. Rather than allow Haitians to select a new leader, the U.S. set up a transitional council for Haiti, led by Edgar LeBlanc Phillis. And it's important to note here, I should probably put this in the article, that a requirement to be a part of that transitional council was that you were in favor of this Kenyan deployment to Haiti. And so this definitely will go on. The Haitian people get no say in that, according to the U.S. government. The Washington-led process to appoint a new head of state iced out leaders of the paramilitary groups. Vital Home Innocent, the head of one faction, told CNN that if the militants did not have a seat at the table, they would gain influence by other means. So this really suggests that Haiti's problems are not going to be resolved here, but are rather still intensifying. All right, next up here, an article I wrote for the Institute on May 2nd. This one is about Ukraine. It is titled, As Russian Forces Advance, Ukraine Struggles to Build New Defensive Lines. So Russian forces are advancing in several places across the 600-mile front line in Ukraine, straining Kiev's ability to build new rear fortifications. Some of the Ukrainian military fault the country's leadership for not building stronger second and third line defenses last year, while Russian troops were stalled. According to a dozen Ukrainian soldiers, government officials, and construction company directors who spoke with the Associated Press, Kiev is struggling to set up new defensive lines as its forces retreat. The officials cited several issues, including decision-making last year, bureaucracy in doling out military contracts, and ammunition shortages. A deputy infantry commander fighting near Avdiivka explained that the defensive line was needed to be built last year during Ukraine's offensive. There was an absence of responsibility. People didn't understand that fortifications can save your life if you don't do it in advance. Many people thought we wouldn't need to prepare such lines. They didn't expect a new Russian offensive. And so they were so confident that last summer's counteroffensive was going to be successful. They said, why build defensive lines in Ukraine if we're going on the offensive? We'll build new defensive lines after our offensive stalls, and we'll build those around the new territory we captured. But there, I guess, wasn't just enough concern that counteroffensive may not be successful. Last summer, at Washington's insistence, Kiev launched a counteroffensive that failed to retake much territory due to deeply entrenched Russian defensive lines. And so, towards the end of 2022, the West starts talking about, we're going to conduct this major offensive in Ukraine next year, and Russia starts preparing for that offensive by building significant defensive lines. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis explained in an article, I believe this was in the National Interest, about a month before the offensive began, that the Ukrainian forces would essentially run into a Russian buzzsaw, and that does seem to be what happened. The Russian forces were just well entrenched, well positioned. They had multiple lines of defense. They had air superiority, and so when the Ukrainians went in, the assault just absolutely failed on its face. The AP notes that the Ukraine's lack of adequate defensive lines has now helped Russia make significant military gains, and consistent enemy fire hinders building of new defensive lines. In a Telegram post on Sunday, Kiev's commander-in-chief, Syrsky, said that the situation at the front had escalated, adding, trying to seize the strategic initiative and break through the front lines, the enemy has concentrated its main force in several directions, creating a significant advantage in force and in means. In the Battle of Chasiv Yar, a Donetsk city, a Ukrainian soldier said the lack of fortified positions allowed Russian forces to prevail, with over 100 men killed or missing after a major withdrawal from the area. We lost department commanders, platoon commanders, company commanders, and sergeants. That's it. We lost the entire skeleton of brigade, the soldier explained to the Associated Press. Rather than use military engineers to complete the process, Kiev has elected to pay construction companies to build third-line defenses. Ukraine has awarded contracts without following the typical building process, raising fears of corruption. Additionally, one contractor reported progress on the fortifications has been exaggerated to satisfy the government demands. And I know there have been a lot of doom predictions for Ukraine that its military was going to collapse, and for 2 years now it hasn't, and has fought the Russians and tried to wage offensives and things like that. And so I don't want to say that this is a sign that the Ukrainians military is about to collapse, but it does appear that Russia is set to at least make major gains in the coming days and months, really, as they prepare for their what is expected to be a summer counteroffensive. And the Ukrainians just don't seem to be ready to fight them off. So as all this is happening, we have this article from DaveDeCamp.antiwar.com, May 2nd. Macron reaffirms that sending NATO troops to fight Russia in Ukraine shouldn't be ruled out. So this is absolutely insane. So Dave writes, Macron has reaffirmed that he believes NATO should not rule out the idea of sending troops to Ukraine to fight Russia despite the obvious risks of nuclear war. When asked in an interview published in The Economist if he stood by his position about possibly sending ground troops to Ukraine, Macron said, absolutely, as I said, I'm not ruling anything out because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out. He said Russian forces broke through Ukraine. If Russian forces broke through Ukrainian lines and Ukraine requested NATO troops, it should be seriously considered. And we know that this is something that is very possible. So this is absolutely terrifying, and we'll keep you up to date on anything that happens with this potential deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine. Now, this is a little bit of a follow-up of an article that we talked about on Monday's show and something I wrote last weekend for antiwar.com. So Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State, had gone to China, met with Xi, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and a couple of others, high-ranking people within China. And rather than, say, we're going to start these new joint projects together, we're going to work to improve not only the world, but our bilateral relationship, Blinken ended his visit by saying that China, if you don't back away from sending Russia dual-use equipment, we're going to start sanctioning Russian companies, and it seems that some of that is going on. So the U.S. military on Wednesday announced sanctions on hundreds of entities for allegedly supporting Russia's military-industrial base, including 20 companies based in China and Hong Kong. The Chinese companies are accused of providing Russia with technology that could be used in the development of drones and missiles. The U.S. also targeted individuals and other companies based in Russia, Turkey, Slovakia, Azerbaijan, Belgium, and the UAE. The sanctions are the most wide-ranging the U.S. has imposed to target China's trade relationship with Russia. The measures come after Secretary of State Blinken visited Beijing last week and threatened the U.S. would take action unless China reduced trade with its neighbor. And so this seems a little bit quick. If the U.S. really wanted China to curtail trade with Russia, probably should have given them a little bit more time to do that. Making this decision, pulling the trigger so quickly, seems like the U.S. was already planning to do this, and it really didn't matter how China reacted to Blinken's visit. Now, it's also possible that Blinken went and told Xi that, hey, we're going to do this unless Russia or China rolls back its trade with Russia. And she laughed in his face or just explicitly said, no, we're not going to do that. All right, next up here, U.S. Philippines working on intelligence sharing deal amid China tensions. The U.S. and the Philippines are working on new intelligence sharing deal as tensions are soaring between Manila and Beijing in the South China Sea. The Defense Post reported that the U.S. and Philippines are in discussions about the potential agreement known as the General Security Military Information Agreement, GSOMIA. During the talks in Washington last week, in a joint statement, the two nations wanted to conclude the GSOMIA by the end of 2024. The agreement would formalize intelligence sharing between the two militaries and create protocols for top secret information. And we're seeing this happen more and more in the Indo-Pacific. We've entered into these kind of agreements with India as well, so I'm sure this will be seen as highly provocative by China in an attempt for the U.S. to really wade in on China, what China views as its own sovereign territory. All right, next up here, We're getting into the Israel section of the show, but we're going to start off talking about campus protests, rhetoric in the U.S., and things like that. So, House passes bill that conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. This one from Dave DeCamp on May 1st. The House on Wednesday overwhelmingly passed a bill that conflates criticisms of the modern state of Israel with anti-Semitism and will mandate the definition be used by the Department of Education while enforcing federal anti-discrimination laws. The bill could be used to crack down on pro-Palestinian protesters at college campuses across the country who have been falsely labeled anti-Semitic, despite Jewish students participating in the protests, and by all accounts, the Jewish students are participating in disproportionate numbers. The legislation adopts the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which lists drawing comparisons of contemporary Israel's policy to that of the Nazis as an example of anti-Semitism. The IHRA also defines anti-Semitism as applying double standards to Israel by requiring of it behavior not expected or demanded of another democratic nation, and denying the Jewish people the right of self-determination by claiming the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And I've seen particularly fairly popular commentator Tim Pool has been making a big deal out of this, going, oh, why isn't anybody concerned about what's happening in Burma or Myanmar when they're all concerned about what's happening in Israel. And, a part of my reason for my concern about what's happening in Israel is because in 2016, I saw the ethnic cleansing that Myanmar carried out against the Rohingya in the north of that country. And now all those people are still just living in squalor and in these horrible refugee camps. I read from time to time about how some people try to flee and they end up dying there. I believe that's the Sea of Bengal. People die getting trampled to death by elephants in these camps. Of course, there's no formal government or rule of law, things like that. So gangs rise up. I mean, this is really not the kind of place that you want to live in. About I think 1 million, hundreds of thousands at least of these people were forced into Bangladesh from Myanmar during the ethnic cleansing campaign. And again, I saw that could happen. And that's part of the reason why I'm so concerned about what's happening in Gaza. So, people like to say you have to care about every single thing going on in the world, which is obviously impossible for people to do, right? The Israel is a specific issue for Americans because of the U.S.'s unyielding commitment to Israel, not only providing, billions of dollars of aid and weapons, but also all the diplomatic cover and just all the political support that is constantly voiced by our leadership. So back to today's article here. The bill passed in a vote of 320 to 91 and now heads to the Senate for a vote and received no votes from 21 Republicans and 70 Democrats. Opponents said they voted against the legislation because it threatened the First Amendment. So Representative Matt Gaetz, a Republican from Florida, wrote on X, "Anti-Semitism is wrong, but this legislation is written without regard for the Constitution, common sense, or even common understanding of the meaning of words." Gabe pointed to another part of the IHRA definition list, claiming that Jews killing Jesus is an example of anti-Semitism. The gospel itself would meet this definition of anti-Semitism under the terms of this bill, he said. Republican Thomas Massie opposed the bill as well and said it would put forward with the intent to increase prosecution of activity on campus. Representative Jerry Nadler, a Democrat from New York, and this is interesting because he's a very mainstream guy. He, I believe, was one of the lead prosecutors in Trump's first indictment or first impeachment. So Nadler said, "Speech that is critical of Israel alone does not constitute unlawful discrimination. By encompassing purely political speech about Israel into Title VI, Abbott ambit this bill sweeps too broadly. Nadler made similar comments last year when opposing a bill that conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, noting that there are Jews who oppose Zionism. This resolution ignores the fact that even today, certain Orthodox Hasidic Jewish communities, the Satmars in New York and others, and as other adherents of the pre-state Jewish labor movement have held views that are at odds with the modern Zionist conception, he said. And so he's pointing out that this bill is actually going to end up calling a lot of Jews and labeling them as anti-Semitic, which is obviously ridiculous, but that's kind of how American politics are right now. They're absolutely absurd. Everything is such a huge reaction. Everything's reactionary, and they always go way too far, and this time it's really going to hurt the First Amendment. All right, so on the campus protest, which, by the way, I've read that over 1,700 students, Dave has 2,000 students here in his article, his account, that have been arrested so far, and it does seem to me that, generally speaking, the protests have been peaceful. Most of the violence seems to me to be carried out either by the police or by counter protesters, and that's particularly true in UCLA, where I would say what the counter protesters did was, excessively violent. This was not the same thing as, say, what was happening in 2016 between MAGA and Antifa, where at least both sides were kind of both fighting. This was just the abuse of the pro-Palestinian protesters at UCLA, which was wrong. But still, you notice this time and time again, that anytime there's any rhetoric from the pro-Palestinian side that is even questionable, it's used to condemn the whole movement. And not just at one campus, but across the country. And yet at a Israeli protests, say, and we saw some of these very early on after October 7th, where Medea Benjamin would go as a counter protester and say, what the Israelis are doing is wrong. They shouldn't carry out this brutal military campaign in Gaza. And the pro-Israeli protesters were saying that they hope she gets raped and murdered and things. And this has been repeated time and time again. You hear this all the time. And so it's just clearly this very absurd double standard where anybody who is critical of Israel, anything that anyone who's critical of Israel says reflects on all of us. But when it comes to these supporters of Israel, they could be as violent as they want, and whatever they do just gets dismissed and it's not applied to the whole movement. All right, so next up here, Biden says protests haven't made him reconsider support for Gaza slaughter. What a surprise. 80-year-old man isn't going to change his views. President Biden said on Thursday that the college protests on campuses across the country have not caused him to rethink his unconditional support for Israelis' slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And I mean, there's some fairness to this. For Biden, he's been supporting Israel 3 times longer than most of these protesters have even been alive. And in government positions, by the way, right? He's been in government supporting Israel for that long. So Biden made the comments when answering questions from a reporter after he delivered brief remarks about the protest movement. The president portrayed demonstrations as violent, but the only significant violence occurred when police moved to clear out encampments or occupied buildings and when pro-Israeli crowds attacked an encampment at UCLA. So let me be clear. Peaceful protests in America, violent protests are not protected. Peaceful protest it is. It's against the law when violence occurs, Biden said. He said, destroying property is not a peaceful protest. It's against the law. Vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campuses, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduations. None of this is a peaceful protest, which is just amazing. Amazing that President Biden is saying this 4 years after the George Floyd protests and the BLM protests across America, where there was, rampant vandalism, arson, encampments like this, disrupting all kinds of people being able to go to their jobs, to return home, shutting down roads. I mean, this was all common. And, this was the voice of the people. And now that the voice of the people are against Joe Biden, they're violent, and what they're doing is against the law, and they need to be stopped. Even when these protests are clearly far less, and almost no violence exists at these pro-Palestinian protests. So Biden made clear that he supports a crackdown on protesters, which has led to over 2,000 arrests across the country. We are a civil society, and order must prevail. The president also again appeared to smear the movement as anti-Semitic, despite the fact that Jewish students are involved in the protests. He said there should be no place on any campus, no place in America for anti-Semitism or threats of violence against Jewish students. And again, I know I made this point before, but I think it's just so important to say. In 2020, when the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, and people claimed, oh, it's racist against white people, everybody, laughed at them, said that that's not what's going on here. This is a protest movement about, supporting the black people and the oppression that they face in this country. And you were considered absolutely stupid for saying that. And now it's completely changed, again, flipped on its head, and it's a pro-Palestinian protest, but they view it as anti-Semitic, and so they use this slander. So while he condemned the protests, Biden says he does not believe the National Guard should intervene. This is some good news. We'll see what happens with the campus protests. The end of the college semester is coming up. That suggests to me they could die out pretty soon, but we'll see what happens in the coming weeks. And of course, what happens at the DNC convention this summer in Chicago. All right. Next up here, U.S. Gaza pier could be operational by the weekend. Unnamed officials said the floating pier and causeway that Washington hopes to use to bring aid into Gaza could be completed by Friday, which is today, with aid deliveries beginning on Saturday. The development comes as the cost of the pier has nearly doubled, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin admitted that the operations put U.S. soldiers in danger. One U.S. and European official told Politico the pier could be operational by the weekend. The pier and causeway constructed by the U.S. are designed to bring some aid to the starving people of Gaza. The famine in Gaza has been intentionally provoked by Tel Aviv, with Washington's full-throated support. The Pentagon's plan to deliver aid into Gaza by sea calls for constructing a floating pier and causeway attached to a shore. The aid will be delivered to the pier, which is going to be anchored a few miles offshore, before being placed on small boats to bring to the causeway. From there, the UN will deliver the aid, with Israeli forces providing security. The project is already costing U.S. taxpayers double the projected amount, now $320 million, and that's going to be the cost for the first 90 days, so it's certainly going to end up higher than that. Over 1,000 troops are involved in the operation. During a congressional hearing earlier this week, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told Representative Matt Gaetz that it was possible that U.S. troops could come under fire. He went on to say that soldiers may return fire, significantly escalating the U.S. involvement in the Israeli onslaught. The high price tag and risk to U.S. soldiers come with relatively little reward. The sea route is only expected to bring about 90 to 150 truckloads of goods into Gaza each day, well below the UN request to see 500 trucks enter the strip on a daily basis. Before October 7th, 508 trucks entered Gaza per day, plus commercial goods crossed into the territory. After the Hamas attack, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant declared that Tel Aviv would collectively punish all Palestinians living in Gaza, but by denying them food, water, and other life-saving aid. In addition to the pier being an ineffectual method of aid delivery, Israeli forces have demolished Palestinian homes to make way for the project. The new humanitarian collected witness statements and satellite images to prove that homes around the staging area for the pier have been demolished. And so, I just want to expand on that a little bit, because this is something that Israel really seems to be trying to do, is have any excuse they can to destroy as much of the infrastructure in Gaza as possible. And so the plan here, right, is now they get to have a staging area within the Gaza Strip, and all the houses, say within half a kilometer of the staging area, need to now be knocked down and destroyed. So after nearly 7 months of blockade, nearly all 2.3 million Palestinians living in the Strip are struggling to find food. Hundreds of thousands are already in famine condition, and scores have starved to death. While the pier is ostensibly meant to deliver aid to Palestinians, according to a report from the Jerusalem Post, the idea to build the pier actually came from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A reporter for Israel's Khan News said last month that during a meeting of the Israeli Knesset Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, Netanyahu suggested the pier could be used to remove Palestinians from Gaza. And so just a couple other observations on this before I move on. I have a image up on the screen here. And for anybody who is just listening, if you go read my article at the Institute, it's the cover image for the article. And it shows the pier, and it looks fairly insignificant and quite dinky and not very sophisticated. I guess I expected to see quite a lot more from this pier, and so I'm kind of concerned that, first of all, this costs $320 million, but also how well it will be able to hold up and whether, if the seas get rough, and how much they're really going to be able to do with this pier. Also, the size of the pier makes me wonder why the pier is even needed in the first place. If the issue is just getting the cargo onto smaller boats that can deliver aid to the causeway, why not just do like at sea transits from larger cargo ships to smaller ones? So I have a lot of questions about this whole process. It still doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me as far as why they have to do it this way to deliver aid. And then a couple more things. One that is always important to mention, that the U.S. is allowing Israel to have this aid go through its inspection process. So who knows how much, first of all, that's going to slow down the inspections process, but also B, how much of the life-saving equipment will be stripped out of whatever gets into Gaza during that process. And then the last thing here is we have these U.S. troops taking the cargo from the pier to the causeway, and from there it will be, I guess, Israeli forces that take control, and then they will give it to the UN to distribute within Gaza. So the causeway, of course, is attached to the shore. And Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin says, well, there's going to be no U.S. boots on the ground in Gaza. But this seems like toddler logic to me, where, you know, the rules of the game change upon what they're trying to do, right? And so the idea that no boots on the ground means physically you can't have U.S. soldiers have their feet on the ground, but having them on a causeway anchored to the shore 100 yards away is somehow different. It is, you know, just like trying to play the floor is hot lava with a child or something like that. It's just absolutely silly, and the rules are changing, and these people are acting like children when there's a genocide going on. All right, so this is an article I found from Medium. It was written by Amos Goldberg, and he's a Holocaust professor at an Israeli university, and he concludes Gaza is happening, or genocide is happening in Gaza. He wrote, yes, it is genocide. It is difficult and painful to admit it, but despite all that, and despite all the efforts to think otherwise, after 6 months of brutal war, we can no longer avoid this conclusion. Jewish history will henceforth be stained with the mark of Cain for the most horrible of crimes, which cannot be erased from its forehead. As such, this war is the way will be viewed in history's judgment for generations to come. From a legal point of view, there is still no telling what the International Court of Justice in The Hague will decide, although in light of its temporary ruling, and so far in light of its increasing prevalence of reports by jurists, international organizations, and investigative journalists, the trajectory of the prospect judgment seems quite clear. And I think he makes a really important point. Now, that he's talking about the ICJ ruling, the International Court of Justice, which is the UN court or the world court that settles disputes between nations. There is also the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court, which is not tied to the UN. So with the ICJ, anyone who's a member state of the United Nations is a member of the ICJ. With the ICC, you have to be an explicit member of the treaty for the ICC, of which both the U.S., Israel, and several other nations are not. So Netanyahu says ICC arrest warrant would be an anti-Semitic hate crime. So Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said Tuesday that the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for him and other Israeli leaders over the genocidal campaign in Gaza. It would be an anti-Semitic hate crime. So reports first surfaced over the weekend that the ICC might issue arrest warrants for Israeli leadership. If this does happen, it will be an indelible stain on humanity. It would be an unprecedented anti-Semitic hate crime that would add fuel to the anti-Semitic incitement that is already raging around the world. Netanyahu added that other world leaders should come out against the ICC's investigation of Israel. Israel expects leaders of the free world to come out strongly against this scandalous step, a step that will harm the self-defense not only of the state of Israel, but of all democracies. So I don't think Netanyahu will end up in jail at The Hague. I mean, we all hope he should be in everything, as well as George Bush and a lot of others. I think that's unlikely. What I'm trying to get a read on here is if the ICC is actually doing anything against Israel, or if this is, I think there's a few possibilities here. One, this could be a bout of paranoia on a genocidal, on behalf of a genocidal state. I believe that is something that, could very possibly be happening here. Two, there could be a low level thing going on in the ICC. People could be talking about trying to look into investigating Netanyahu and the Israeli government. The Israeli government gets word of this, and then they're trying to, establish the United States against this now before it becomes an issue in the future, right? Israel is just trying to get ahead of things on this. I also want to throw out the possibility, and I haven't heard anybody else talk about this yet, but I do think it's got to be something that could be considered, is what if Netanyahu here is basically trying to constrain his own government? Right? I'm sure there are plenty of people in the government, Gallant and others, who feel that they could be indicted by the ICC. And Netanyahu does have a particular ability to get the U.S. and other Western countries to do what Israel wants. And so if they're worried about being indicted, maybe they feel that Netanyahu in some ways is really the man that can protect them. And so I almost wonder if this is essentially being fabricated by the Israeli prime minister. So everybody feels like, we got to keep this guy in charge because he's the one that's going to save us from the ICC. Now, Israel tells the U.S. it will target the Palestinian Authority if the ICC issues warrants. Israel has told the U.S. that if the ICC issues arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials, it would take a strong stand against the Palestinian Authority that could lead to its collapse, which this is just ridiculous. And it's like cartoonish villainy, right? Like, if you punish me for something I did wrong, then I'm going to hurt this even more innocent party. Just absolutely disgusting. All right, here, UN scale of destruction in Gaza not seen since World War II and will take 16 years to rebuild. So Dave DeCamp, May 2nd, antiwar.com. The United Nations said on Thursday that the scale of the destruction in the Gaza Strip hasn't been seen since World War II, and it will take a minimum of 16 years to rebuild homes in the Strip. We haven't seen anything like this since 1945, a UN Assistant Secretary General said. That intensity in such a short time and the massive scale destruction. He said that 72% of all residential buildings in Gaza have been partially or completely destroyed. The United Nations Development Program initial estimates for reconstruction of the Gaza Strip surpassed 30 billion and could reach up to 40 billion. And of course, the Biden administration has this completely convoluted plan where Saudi Arabia is going to agree to normalize relations with Israel in exchange for a nuclear program, weapons, and a defense pact with the U.S., and then Saudi Arabia will spend the $30 to $40 billion to rebuild Gaza, just so Israel could come knock it down again. All right, next up here, there is widespread belief among U.S. officials that Israel cannot beat Hamas. And so this is something that we've talked about on the show plenty of times, but it's very interesting that the New York Times is reporting this and that it's a widespread belief among American officials. So throughout the past several months, there have been multiple signs that the U.S. does not believe Israel could achieve its goals in Gaza, yet the Biden administration has continued to support the slaughter of Palestinians in the Strip. In March, the U.S. intelligence agencies released their annual threat assessment and said Israel will face lingeringly armed resistance for years to come, and that the Israeli military would struggle to destroy Hamas's underground infrastructure. The Washington Post also reported in March that the U.S. doesn't think Israel had clear or attainable goals as far back as October. We never had a clear sense of what the Israelis had as a definable and achievable military objective, a source familiar with the October 27th Biden administration meeting on the situation in Gaza told the Post. From the very beginning, there is a sense of us not knowing how the Israelis are going to do what they say they are going to do. The Times report focused on Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Israel and the differences in the messaging from the administration and Netanyahu. Blinken said the U.S. was still opposed to Israel invading Rafah without a clear plan for civilians, but Netanyahu's message was that an invasion will happen no matter what. Blinken also called on Hamas to accept Israel's latest proposal for its hostage deal and temporary ceasefire, but Netanyahu signaled that he wasn't interested. The Israeli leader vowed to invade Rafah with or without a deal with Hamas. And again, this is Netanyahu absolutely humiliating his main benefactors, right? You have Blinken going to Israel and going to Hamas. Hey, you got a great deal on the table here. The Israelis are offering a ceasefire. You should really take this. This is a really good step. And then the Israeli prime minister, who the Americans are advocating on behalf of here, goes, you shouldn't take the deal because we're not going to accept it and we'll invade Rafah either way. Absolutely crazy. So a little bit more on that here. This from Dave DeCamp, May 1st. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told Secretary of State Antony Blinken during a meeting on Wednesday they would not agree to a permanent ceasefire and Israel to end its operations in Gaza in exchange for a deal that would free the Israeli hostages. He told Blinken that we are interested in reaching a deal and determined to topple Hamas, an Israeli official told the Times of Israel. So, Netanyahu wants everything. He wants to rescue the hostages and not to make a deal with Hamas and destroy Hamas. Obviously, that is impossible, and the real goal here is just to destroy all of Gaza. All right, so this is from Jason Ditz, antiwar.com. The Israeli military chief says Israel preparing for offensive against Lebanon. So touring the northern Israeli border with Lebanon, the Israeli military chief of staff met with Northern Command for an assessment of the planned military operations against Lebanon and told reservists they are preparing for an offensive in the north. He added its objectives are both to restore security to the communities near the Gaza Strip and to bring hostages back home securely. He didn't elaborate on the specifics or the timing of the operation, but the Israeli military brass have made a big deal of the planned operations against Lebanon. The military goal has been presented as both moving Hezbollah back from the border and allowing refugees to return to northern Israel. Israel and Hezbollah have been trading fire since October, and a huge number of civilians have been displaced on both sides of the border. If anything, the situation has been escalating in recent weeks. This has been simmering, and that simmer is getting hotter and hotter. I guess it's getting closer and closer to a boil. It does not seem we are quite there yet at this point, but I think it's a huge concern that we had these statements coming out of Hezbollah. I'm not saying, or out of Israel about Hezbollah. I'm not saying that I think the invasion of Lebanon by Israel would start within, say, the next several weeks. I think they would probably want to wrap up operations in Rafah first, but this is very important to keep our eye on and continue to talk about. All right, a few stories here about Yemen, Houthis show long-range attack on ship in the Indian Ocean. So the Yemen's Houthis targeted an Israeli-linked container ship in the Arabian Sea, demonstrating an ability to hit targets at long range after the Houthi leader Malik al-Houthi vowed to expand attacks into the Indian Ocean. The attack on the MSC Orion took place last Friday but wasn't confirmed by maritime authorities until Tuesday. The crew of the vessel said they discovered debris that looked like a drone and reported minor damage and said that no one was hurt. According to Joint Maritime Information Center, the ship was hit in the Indian Ocean about 170 miles south of the Yemeni island of Socotra, which is not controlled by the Houthis, and about 400 miles from the Yemeni mainland. And I would imagine that would mean even like another 100 or 200 miles from Houthi territory. So who knows how far they actually fired this missile. Because most of southern Yemen is controlled by either the separatists or somebody within the Saudi Emirati coalition of forces. The MSC Orion is owned by the London-based Zodiac Maritime, which is part of the Israeli billionaire offers Zodiac Group. The Houthis have been targeting Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden last year in response to the Israeli slaughter in Gaza, and expanded to target American and British shipping after the US and UK began a new bombing campaign in Yemen on January 12th. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, restarted attacks on commercial shipping last week after a about 2-week lull. During the lull, the Houthis were examining incentives to stop the attacks put forward by the U.S., which included an offer to fully lift the blockade on Yemen that's been imposed since 2015, but the Houthis decided to stick with the position that the campaign will continue until there is a ceasefire. And I brought this up pretty early on after the Houthis started attacking the ships, and I said, look, I'm not pro-war. I don't think, they should be attacking these ships. I do think this is going to work out well for the Houthis. And the fact that the U.S. offered to lift the blockade of Yemen and almost granting the Houthis a fairly substantial amount of legitimacy in doing so suggests that I was kind of right about that. That as far as this goes, the Houthis have been willing to sustain the bombing that the US and UK are able to put forward, and have been able to inflict a far larger hit on commercial shipping than has been exacted on them. All right, next up here, another story on Yemen. This one from Jason Ditz. Al-Qaeda bombing kills 6 members of South Yemen secessionist force. An explosive device struck a military vehicle carrying troops belonging to the secessionist Southern Transitional Council force today in Yemen, killing at least 6 and wounding 11. The attack was blamed on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that's AQAP, and took place in Yemen's a southern Yemen province. AQAP has long has a presence in that province and has effective control over that province during much of the Arab Spring. The STC is backed by the UAE and has designs on the southern secession of Yemen. While it's not formally a part of the Saudi-backed recognized government, is decidedly opposed to the Shia Houthi movement in the north. Since splitting from the government, the STC has had de facto control over much of southern Yemen. The group's operations are aimed at regaining control over the region and at times resisting both the AQAP and the pro-Saudi forces. I think the pro-Saudi forces include the Giants Brigade, the Giants Brigade is a UAE bad force, is the force of the nephew of the former leader of Yemen, Salah. I forget what his first name is, maybe Bleak or something like that, and he has a small force that he has kept together. And so this is just the combination of forces and things going on in southern Yemen. This has been going on for a long time, and of course a lot of the reason for all the instability in Yemen roots back to the one-man election organized by Hillary Clinton in Yemen, and the ouster of Ali Saleh, and the ushering in a Mansour Hadi who couldn't keep the country together and caused the in large part the catastrophe that faces Yemen today. Of course the war largely kind of subsided in 2022, 2023 between the Houthis and the Saudi and UAE bad forces, but still the blockade has remained on Yemen, and now the Houthis are using it, are in control of Yemen and launching attacks on commercial shipping in support of the Palestinians. All right, next up here. This one from Dave DeCamp, last article I have today. Report: Russian troops enter base housing U.S. troops in Niger. So Russian troops have entered a military base in Niger that houses U.S. military personnel, Reuters reported on Thursday, citing a senior U.S. defense official. The official said that the Russian troops were at Air Base 101 in Niger's capital and were using a separate hangar and were not mingling with U.S. troops. The situation is not great, but short term is manageable. CNN later reported that the Russian troops have been operating out of the base for at least several weeks. The news comes as the U.S. said it would agree to a request from Niger's military-led government to leave the country, but the U.S. continues to drag its feet on the withdrawal. Niger said severed several of its military relationships in March after the U.S. lectured the Nigerian leader about their growing ties with Russia. Last month, a whistleblower told Congress that the U.S. refusal to withdraw from Niger was putting U.S. troops in danger. The whistleblower, a senior Air Force leader, said that the U.S. officials were suppressing intelligence to maintain a facade of good relations between the U.S. and Niger. So Niger's government took power after a July 2023 coup, allowing Russian troops to enter Airbase 101 could be a pressure tactic from Niger's government to get the U.S. to withdraw. Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell said on April 19th that the U.S. agreed to leave, but the following week, Joint Chiefs Vice Chairman Admiral Christopher Grady claimed that no final decision had been made. The U.S. has a major drone base in Niger known as Airbase 201, and that cost over $100 million to build. Airbase 201 serves as a hub of U.S. operations in the region, and the U.S. doesn't want to give it up. So hopefully nothing really happens between the U.S. and Russian troops. Maybe this is our best opportunity for them to get together, play some games of basketball, or something like that. I doubt they're going to start shooting at each other at this base, but it does, just kind of reveal the absurdity of the U.S. empire in 2024. All right, everybody, thank you all so much for tuning into the show today. I'll be back with more next week.